Welcome to our first big public event of this academic year and political season. It's always a political season in New Jersey, as no doubt you all know. And the Eagleton Institute of Politics has the privilege of being engaged with whatever is going on in politics as we go forward from year to year. With just 20 days to go until the elections, it's a good moment to talk politics. In fact, as those of you who've attended past Eagleton events know, for us it's always all politics. It's a theme we've used to brand many programs that have brought to Rutgers some of the nation's most well-known political strategists and observers, and tonight is no different, no exception. We're proud and honored that our friends and strong supporters at the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation have funded such Eagleton programs in the past. And for those of you who have attended them, you know that it's become, thank you, a very happy habit for me to thank that foundation for its support. And that is also true tonight. When we approached the foundation with the idea of tonight's speaker, they were immediately receptive. For that, we are, as always, very grateful, and happily tonight we have among us the Foundation's president, Laura Barron, and Laurie's executive director, Jean Korff. They've made this program possible, and I'd appreciate it very much if you join me in thanking them. Laura and Jean. I'd also appreciate it if you would indulge me in a personal note, just to take a moment. He doesn't know that I'm doing this, but I want to congratulate Jean Korff publicly for winning a Tony Award this year. He may be the only person in the room who won a Tony. Has anybody else in the room won a Tony or an Academy Award or an Emmy this year? As one of the producers of a show called All the Way, which was the Broadway play in which Bryan Cranston starred as LBJ in what was, to make it an understatement, a brilliant performance. Gene's interest in politics and his love of the theater came together spectacularly. He was one of the producers. He stood on the stage the night they got the Tony Awards. And much to my personal pleasure as a theater fan, I not only had a wonderful time watching that performance, but also watching him win his Tony. So congratulations again. On to more Tonys. It would be an understatement to say that tonight's special visitor, Steve Schmidt, has an interest in politics. It might be more accurate to say that politics is his calling, perhaps best known as a consummate Republican strategist. Steve Schmidt's resume includes the campaigns of President George W. Bush, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, Senator and presidential candidate John McCain. He was also a senior staffer for President Bush, working on a wide range of issues at the intersection of communications, policy development, legislative advocacy, and political strategy. Today, Steve is vice chairman for public affairs for Eagleton, which is the world's largest independent public relations firm, where he serves as a strategic counselor to CEOs and senior decision makers at global corporations, professional sports franchises, nonprofit organizations, and even academic institutions. He also does a little teaching at places like this, and I hope in some other states, and I hope one of these days we'll be able to attract him to come and teach a course here. At this moment, most of us know Steve Schmidt perhaps best as a political analyst on television. He sometimes appears on Real Time with Bill Maher. I don't know if there are Bill Maher fans in the audience, but my husband is addicted, and so I get to see it every week. I've seen him on election nights and on MSNBC commenting on politics and analyzing election results. Those of you who've listened to him will agree with me that he consistently combines an encyclopedic knowledge of the details of politics with a broader understanding of the big picture. He's always insightful and measured, clearly a loyal representative of his party, but not an uncritical one. You never know exactly what he will say, but you can anticipate, and you really can always anticipate that it will be thoughtful, candid, and nuanced. Amidst the turbulence that is our national politics today, he offers clarity and what I call tempered judgment, or what I prefer to call wisdom. We're especially happy to present Steve Schmidt to this audience at Rutgers because he's a Jersey boy by birth. I don't know if you knew that. He grew up nearby, an Eagle Scout and graduate of North Plainfield High School, where he was voted most likely to succeed. Indeed, he has already succeeded, and he can still look forward to a long career ahead. I'm going to say something, I don't know if he wants me to say this or he was going to save it, but I learned it this afternoon, much to my chagrin, which is that his success did not include being accepted at Rutgers University. And he can tell you that. I'm embarrassed to have to admit that. Indeed, he has, as I said, already succeeded spectacularly, and it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Steve Schmidt.
Young lady came up before. She said, "Watch the stairs." I said, "You don't have to say that to me." I said, "Most people can navigate stairs safely. I'm proof that not all people can." And but it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you tonight at Rutgers University, State University of New Jersey, one of this country's great academic institutions, and as someone who is the father of 3 children who have largely been raised out west in California, and we live in Park City, Utah now, it is a great delight to be around people who speak English with the proper accent. I have no small amount of teasing directed at me by my children when I say words like orange or dog, and they are very curious about where that accent comes from. We bring them every other year to the Jersey Shore to keep in touch with their culture that they are unfamiliar with growing up in Utah. But it's great to be back in New Jersey. Great to be with all of you tonight. I don't tell this story very often, but being from New Jersey played a key role at a key moment in my political career. Some of you may recall during the early days of the 2004 presidential campaign that the Vice President, Dick Cheney, told the senior United States Senator, Pat Leahy from Vermont, to go himself on the floor of the United States Senate. And this sent the Bush campaign into pandemonium. We were at the senior staff meeting in the morning, and the great debate was, should Dick Cheney apologize? Now, I was the only person in the room who did not think that Dick Cheney should apologize to him for doing it. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Whatever you think about Dick Cheney's politics or his judgment on the war, one thing about Dick Cheney is a man of integrity, certainly financial integrity. He was as honest as the day is long, and the attacks being leveled against him with regard to his compensation from Halliburton were complete and total nonsense, and he was rightly very upset about it. And secondly, Pat Leahy, after denouncing him and attacking his integrity and his ethics on the floor of the Senate, came up, threw his arm around him when he walked out onto the floor of the Senate, and he said, "Hey, Dick, how you doing?" And Cheney did not appreciate the hypocrisy and told him to perform an anatomically difficult maneuver. And thirdly, there was no chance Dick Cheney was ever going to apologize. And part of politics is sometimes being for what's going to be at the end of the day. So we had a big debate in the campaign. It was unresolved, and I got a phone call about a half an hour later from Air Force Two. It's the first time I had talked to the vice president on the phone, and he said, "I hear you're the only person in the senior staff meeting that thinks I should not apologize for telling Leahy to go." And I said, "That's right, Mr. Vice President," and I went through all my reasons, and I said, "Besides, sir, I'm from North Jersey." I said, "That's a term of affection where I'm from." About a half hour later, I got a call from Karl Rove, and he said, "The Vice President has put you in charge of all of his stuff for the rest of the campaign." And such a political career was launched. But we're in an interesting moment in American politics, and I don't talk about several things tonight. We'll talk about the midterm elections, talk about the 2016 elections, but I want to talk a little bit about the Republican Party. We'll talk about Republican candidates, and I want to go back in history a little bit to explain, I think, some of the dynamics that are taking place. So the Republican Party was founded in 1854. And by 1858, the Republican Party, which was the abolitionist party, it was a party formed to fight the scourge of slavery. It was the Northern Party and it was the Western Party. And by 1858, the Republican Party is the majority party in all of the Northern and all of the Western states. And of course, the country has a great civil war. It is the bloodiest conflict in the history of the United States. You have roughly 3 million Americans under arms. There were more than 600,000 killed in action. The bloodletting was at a scale that is almost unprecedented in the history of warfare. And the country comes back together. African Americans, until Franklin Roosevelt becomes elected president, or the most reliable constituency of the Republican Party. And when you look at American politics and the shaping and shifting of political coalitions, they tend to happen every 25, every 30 years. And so the Republican Party coalition that wins the Civil War, as the Reconstruction period ends, the South comes back into the state, it remains as the Northern and Western Party, and it dominates presidential elections for a long time to come, with just a few Democrats, James Garfield, Grover Cleveland, elected in the interregnum period up until FDR's ascension to the presidency, where African Americans move from the Republican Party in some significant mass and become Democrats, and the political coalition of the country fundamentally changes as a result of the Depression, the New Deal, and ultimately the Second World War. So we come through the post-Cold War, we come through the post-war period. Dwight Eisenhower is elected president, but of course the civil rights movement comes into full bloom in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, which is the subject of the brilliant play that was referenced at the beginning of this about LBJ, is one of the scenes in that play shows the tension between the Southern senators, of whom Lyndon Johnson was the majority leader, most powerful majority leader in the history of the United States Senate, and Strom Thurmond very famously leaves the Democratic Party. It becomes a member of the Republican Party, and this all sets up Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign and the Southern strategy. So in 1960, there are exactly 4 elected Republicans to the United States Congress, none in the Senate, all in the House, from south of the Mason-Dixon line. 4. So how is it that the Republican Party today stands as the country's Southern party? A party founded in the North and in the West, the abolitionist party has become the Southern party. How did that happen? So in 1968, Richard Nixon, seeing that there are disaffected white voters upset about a Democratic president signing the Civil Rights Act into law, targets those disaffected white voters, it begins a 20-year transition of the Republican Party, where the Republican Party starts to be competitive in the South. By 1988, that transition is complete, and this is the Dukakis election against George Herbert Walker Bush. And what was this election about? These were all the grievance issues that you find in Southern populism. These were faux issues. This was flag burning. It was Willie Horton. It was card-carrying member of the ACLU. It was a classic wedge issue campaign, small issues, designed to turn out that coalition. And so, George Bush, President 41, wins a decisive electoral college landslide victory in 1988. He gets 59.5% of the white vote. The only other president to get higher than 59.5% of the white vote in an American election is Ronald Reagan, who gets 64%. He wins 49 states. The next Republican candidate who gets 59.5% of the white vote is Mitt Romney in 2012. And look at the difference between what 59.5% of the white vote yields in 1988 versus what 59.5% of the white vote yields in 2012. And so the Republican Party has a fundamental demographics problem, which I want to talk about in just a moment. But 1988, that last electoral landslide victory, totally, in my view, solidifies the Republican Party as the Southern party in the country. And for the next 6 presidential elections following that 88 election, the Republican Party loses the popular vote 5 out of the next 6 elections, winning it narrowly in the 2004 campaign when George W. Bush carries Ohio by 140-something thousand votes and is elected with over 50% of the vote, about 51.5% of the vote in a popular vote. So let's look at the Republican Party and some of the issues that it is facing today in 2012. First, it's just a truism of American politics that the Southern Party can be the majority congressional party. The Southern Party never wins presidential elections. It never has, and in my view, it never will. And so for the Republican Party to become competitive again nationally and to win presidential races, it has to grow roots again in the Northeast of the country, the Mountain West of the country, and on the West Coast. I want to talk about California, for example. And I think is like an interesting aspect of American politics is playing out there right now. Sometime in late 2016 to early 2017, the Republican Party will become smaller than the decline to state or independent registration voters in the state of California. And independents are the fastest growing political group in the country. But for the first time since the founding of the Republican Party in 1854, one of the 2 major parties is going to slip into third-party status. This is worrying if you are a Republican, and frankly, if you care about good governance, because in a 2-party system, you need both political parties to be functional. And when you have a political party, as is the case in California, that collapses, there are a lot of pathologies that come along with one-party rule. And increasingly, you see the terrible impact that has had on the state of California. But what happened in California? In 1994, Pete Wilson, who was the incumbent governor, was 17 points behind Kathleen Brown, Jerry Brown's younger sister, who was the state treasurer in California. California is a state that has ballot initiatives, which were a reform era change that allowed issues to be put before voters. They could vote directly on it. And there was an anti-immigration issue on the ballot in 1994. Pete Wilson embraced it completely. This was a state where Hispanics made up roughly 40% of the vote for Ronald Reagan, for all of the Republican candidates in a Republican state. It was a state in 1988 that George Herbert Walker Bush carried, that Ronald Reagan carried commandingly. but the images that people saw on their TV that spring were Mexicans running across the border with dark intonations of they're coming, they keep on coming. And like a mortgage with a giant balloon payment far off in the distance, we got the loan, but then we got the balloon payment. When that balloon payment came, it blew up the Republican Party. In the state that Ronald Reagan was governor of for 8 years, that Richard Nixon called home, and that was home to the most conservative county in America, Orange County. And that implosion of the Republican Party, I worry very much from a Republican perspective on a trend line, is something that we have to be concerned about nationally. A lot of trends for both good and bad start in California. And I think we see a trend playing out in the Republican Party on this front that's worrying. It is true that without exception, every single demographic group in this country that is growing, the Democratic Party is gaining market share. Every single demographic group in this country that is shrinking, the Republican Party is gaining market share. This is a marketing problem. The average listener to the Rush Limbaugh radio program is a white, rural male, 68 plus. Actuarially, there's less of them every day. The millennial generation, the 8th generation, since the founding of the country at the Revolutionary War, is the largest generation in the history of the country by a lot. And actuarially, this generation of Americans, a very high percentage of them, will live to be 100 years old. They will live to the edge of the 22nd century and into it. Think about that for a second. Young people today will live to a point in time that is more distant from the end of World War II than we are today from the Battle of Gettysburg. Every member of that generation by demographic group on the issues that have paralyzed the Republican Party's ability to compete, whether it be on immigration, whether it be on gay marriage, whether it be on a range of personal choice issues from contraception to women's health, are on the other side of where the Republican Party is. And one of the things that political scientists have written fairly extensively about is that once your political identity is formed around age 18, 19, 20, you stay invested in your party and you stay invested in that political identity, barring a traumatic event. For a lot of Americans, that traumatic event was the Jimmy Carter presidency of a certain generation. For many Americans, that traumatic event could possibly be the Obama presidency. However, in order to win an election, you have to have people listen to you. You have to have people be receptive to what you're saying. And so let's talk about immigration for a second. It is impossible mathematically for a Republican candidate to win election to the presidency of the United States without getting roughly 40% of the Hispanic vote. You cannot make the math work. The problem we have as a party is we are defined by our most extreme voices on this issue. So if you were to play a word association game, your average Republican member of Congress, and you were to say, I say Latino, you say, overwhelmingly it'd be legal immigrant. It wouldn't be surgeon or doctor or Silver Star winner or Medal of Honor recipient or governor, even though we have more Hispanic governors than the other party does. In states that are on the border, Texas, New Mexico, led by Republican governors who do very well with this population, we have some lessons to learn. But the message that comes out of Washington, D.C. is we don't like you very much. And before people will vote for you, they have to believe that you respect and you like them. And so on this issue of immigration reform, which is the dominant story every day on Univision, which has the greatest reach and frequency into Spanish-speaking households. And by the way, they all speak English as well. They just like culturally to watch the telenovelas. They like to watch the news in Spanish. And what they hear every day is the constant drumbeat of coming in Republicans with the most outrageous statements that go unrebuked. And so we have collapsed with this constituency from George Bush getting 43% in 2004 to Mitt Romney getting 27%. And it's game, set, match on day one. Now, what's also interesting, I was actually in a meeting, this is true. Unnoticed in the context of coverage is the cataclysmic drop in the Asian voting population. And so Asian voters have gone over the cliff for Republicans as well. And I was actually in a meeting where somebody said, this is true, they said, why are the Asians so mad at us? We haven't done anything to them yet. I pointed out maybe that's what they're worried about. If you don't talk to people with respect and you write off huge parts of the country, you don't deliver a message and ask them to join your cause, very difficult to win an election. And I want to talk about the difference between Reaganism and Jim DeMintism. What Ronald Reagan said, and was right, is that someone who agrees with me 80% of the time is not my political opponent. They're my political ally. Now, what Jim DeMint said, I would rather have 30 purists in the United States Senate than have to be in a majority with people who compromise. Now, of course, and this is important to spend a moment on, how do we define purity? Of course, purity in this case is agreeing with Jim DeMint 100% of the time. Conservatism is a serious governing philosophy, and it's served this country well over its history. Conservatism is not a cult of personality. I'm a conservative because I don't want anyone telling me what to do. And we have come to define conservatism, who is and who is not, on the basis of their fidelity to the most outrageous statements made on any given day by a talk radio host. And when our presidential candidates appear to be intimidated by talk show personalities, the American people, in my view, evaluate that and say, probably that person's going to have a tough time in the room with Vladimir Putin if they're scared of Mark Levin and Rush Limbaugh. When we look at where we are today as a party heading into the 2016 election, if you look at just the states where Democrats have won 6 out of the last 6 elections, and that doesn't count Florida or Ohio or New Mexico or Colorado or Iowa or Virginia or North Carolina or New Hampshire, they have 242 electoral votes with 270 needed to win. When you start out with a foundation of 242 with 270 needed to win, it's very, 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 very difficult to lose a presidential election. And so the next Republican candidates are going to have to do, in my view, for the Republican Party what Bill Clinton did for the Democratic Party in 1992, which was to take an unelectable political party, rebrand it, and make it acceptable to the middle of the American electorate. And we're going to have to see people having the courage to stand up to some of the extremes inside the Republican Party. And one of the interesting aspects of 2012, I've been married for 14 years, and outside of my marriage, I have no idea how any other American uses birth control with the exception of Rick Santorum. And the issue wasn't Rick Santorum starting to talk about birth control as a national security threat during the 2012 election. It was that Mitt Romney didn't look at him on the debate stage and say, are you crazy? We're the pro-life party, not the anti-contraception party. In fact, more of one gets you less of the other, and we're for that. The bungling of this issue and its impact on younger voters, particularly women, across the spectrum, and I tell Republican candidates all the time, make no mistake about it, Republican women are just as offended by Democratic women when they hear 12 white 50-plus-year-old males on a stage holding forth on these issues. It makes them very, very angry. And they're more than 50% of the population. So we're going to have in the Republican Party, I think, a very, very honest discussion about what it's going to take to win in 2016. And when we look at 2016, we're going to need to have a reform Republican with ideas, with policies, who campaigns with fearlessness to get this country moving in the right direction again. And if we don't, then we're not going to have a competitive election season, and we will lose another presidential election. And maybe after that one, the party will be ready to make the turn that it needs to make in order to win. However, despite all of the bleakness structurally around presidential race, Republican Party is in a commanding position with regard to its congressional majorities. Because the Southern Party in the country has always been the majority congressional party. And when we look out across the country right now at the races, let me just say this, is that there's a lot of talk, and you always hear it before elections, and there's always a couple signals you can pick up about what's going to happen. When one side starts talking about how they have the better turnout operation and that there's going to be a number of technical factors that influence the outcome of the election, the reality is that means they're deeply, deeply, very deeply worried. And so where we stand right now, we look at the polls, we have a number of very close races across the country, but it is the case in every wave election, and it was the case in the 2006 wave elections, the 2010 elections. The wave tends to break late, and when you look at what's happening in the country right now on a number of different fronts, first off, the president's approval numbers are essentially in the same territory of where George W. Bush's were at this point in his presidency. They are in the mid-30s, and they are heading lower. The mishandling of issue after issue after issue, and by the way, the criticism of the president now can be made entirely by quotes from Democrats, starting with Leon Panetta and Democratic senators. One need not invoke a single Republican critic of the president to make the point about the president's failed leadership on any one of a number of different fronts. And so we have a situation that I think is developing that Republicans have an opportunity to capitalize on. George Shultz, the great Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, said the most important foreign policy decision that Ronald Reagan ever made was firing the air traffic controllers, because he sent a signal to the world after 4 years of Jimmy Carter that he was different. He did what he said he was going to do. This is not a partisan Republican criticism. This is being written about in editorials around this country, including by some of this nation's most prominent, very liberal newspaper columnists. When the words of the President of the United States become as devalued as his have become, the Syrian red line, we will destroy ISIS. ISIS is advancing, and I want to talk about that in a minute. ISIS stands 15 miles outside of Baghdad, and what stands between 16,000 Americans at our embassy is the Iraqi army and Shia militia backed up by Iranian Republican guards. 15 miles away from that embassy is a force that is not retreating, it is advancing. You could well see a situation that plays out where the totality of the military in this country says his strategy has no chance of succeeding. The most recent commandant of the Marine Corps, who left in, I think, June of this year, said there's not a snowball's chance in hell that the president's strategy will succeed. What stands between an evacuation that would look eerily similar to what happened in Saigon in 1975 could well happen again, soon. The president went out and he talked about Ebola not coming to the United States. Don't worry about it. And we obviously see what's playing out on the news today. We see the global economy beginning to slow. And I want to talk about, real quickly, in an interconnected world, the dangers of a president whose words are as devalued as his have become. The Syrian Red Line was listened to very closely by Vladimir Putin. And there are implications for empty threats in the Crimea and in the Ukraine. As the Asian economies begin to slow, the Chinese economy, what does a society do with a slowing economy with no political outlet like elections? They stoke nationalism. And so you look at the tensions in the South China and the East China Sea, the disputed islands between Japan and China. You look at the territorial disputes between Vietnam and China. Remarkable for many people of a certain age in this room to consider that the United States Navy is again making port calls with ships multiple times a year at the invitation of the Vietnamese to send a message to the Chinese. All of our allies are very deeply worried when they see a president of the United States make empty promises, because they wonder, will we honor our commitments by treaty to Japan? Will we honor our NATO commitments to Poland, to the Baltics? These are real, serious trip lines, and the world is made extremely more dangerous by the actions that we've seen play out over the last couple of months. And so the most optimistic people on earth, the American people, by culture, by tradition, always believing that tomorrow was going to be a little bit better than today, that our children would do just a little bit better if we worked hard and played by the rules. The collapse of that optimism has become definitional in our country. We now are in the middle of the longest period of time where the American people have believed that the country is on the wrong track for the most number of years in the history of Poland. We live in a time where trust has collapsed in very nearly every institution in the country, with the exception of the U.S. military. The political parties, the banks, government, big companies, big unions. There's a prejudice across the board against any big institution. There's a belief by the American people that there's a set of rules for a small elite here and a different set of rules for everybody else over here. And this phenomenon is not just playing out in the United States, it's playing out in Europe. You see this in the rise of the UKIP party in the UK, the National Front in France. You see this playing out in the Netherlands. You see it playing out in Sweden. You see an increasing revulsion against the elites in all of the countries that are Western democracies. You see decrepit institutions that have lost the trust of their people. And what is dangerous at that moment is there's always a demagogue ready to fill that space for the easy answers and the easy scapegoating. And when we look at Western Europe today, we should be more than a little bit worried about the rise of the National Front, for example, in France. Because though it is dressed up and its leader has a nice dress on, the ugliness of the rhetoric is not so distant and not so different from what we've seen in the past on that continent. And it's ominous. So we live in a very, very turbulent, very, very troubled time. And I believe that that anxiety that the American people feel, the stomach churning pit we all get just by the act of turning on the news, all of this, I think, is going to drive a change environment in the election. And the president made a fundamental political mistake. He went out and he said, this election is a referendum on my policies. And as a Republican, I just want to say, Mr. President, we've been hoping that is the case. And so we will see an election, I believe, where Republicans take the United States Senate, will take the United States Senate decisively. We will pick up houses, we will pick up House race seats, but we will lose a couple of governors' races. It will lose some Republican governors out there because there is a strong anti-incumbent sentiment that is running through the country. People who have been in charge, people who are accountable to voters as chief executives. American people aren't particularly happy with a lot of them, so I think that you will see them lose as well. And so Corbett in Pennsylvania, Sam Brownback in Kansas, Scott Walker is opening up a lead, but that remains a tough race. We're going to see Republican governors lose a couple of seats. Now, despite everything that I just said about the doom and gloom, I'm very optimistic about where the country is headed, because we remain the most competitive place to do business on earth. We, thanks to good old-fashioned Yankee ingenuity, a Texas wildcatter, and only in the United States do we have an energy industry that's constituted like ours. And one day, a Texas wildcatter a few years back, when we were having big public policy fights in the country about where to build import terminals to import the liquid natural gas in, the LNG in, he said one day, why don't we try this hydraulic fracturing horizontally? And he changed the world in a fundamental way. We are the richest energy country in the world. We will be net energy exporters. This will create economic growth. This will create jobs. This will lower carbon levels in the atmosphere. This will be bad for Vladimir Putin. It will be bad for the Middle Eastern despots. It will be good for freedom-loving people all over the world, as massive amounts of American and Canadian energy are exported off of this continent. And it's also important to recognize that Mexico has privatized its energy industry over the course of the last year, and that is going to drive tremendous economic growth in Mexico. Mexico stands on the precipice of being a very, very rich country. And Mexican economic growth deals with the immigration issues we face between the two countries. That being said, when we look out ahead and we look at the cost of energy in Europe, we look at the issues that are being faced in the Eurozone economically right now, you will see a reshoring of American manufacturing back to the United States from unstable places like China, from other places in Asia, and even European manufacturing companies who are being priced out of the market because of the cost of energy in Europe and the political manipulation of it by Mr. Putin and by the instability in the Middle East. So when you look at the challenges that our country has, on entitlements, on tax reform, there's just a simple truism here. There's no way for us to solve our entitlement problems either by taxing our way out of them or cutting our way out of them at 1.9% economic growth. At 3.2, 3.3% economic growth, none of these problems are particularly difficult to fix. And so I think it's important for the next Republican presidential candidate to once again attach optimism to conservatism and to communicate to the American people that our policies can be good for 100% of the people 100% of the time, that we have a message about growing the economy, about creating opportunity, where we recognize that the middle class in this country is being squeezed, that the components of the American dream, the mortgage, the house, the 2 cars, they became a shackle and chain and an anchor for millions of Americans as they lost their American dream in the hugely traumatic event of the Great Recession. To deal with that reality, to talk about how we get the country moving again. How do we fix the sclerotic and broken institutions of government? And you see this playing out, whether it's with the IRS, the HHS website, the Ebola response, and the list goes on. None of these institutions are functioning and doing what they are supposed to be doing from a service perspective, how to fix them, how to reform them, how to make them work and deliver services with private sector efficiency. These are all things that are more fruitful territory for Republicans than to be talking anti-government nonsense, as in, we don't want to have a government or we're going to shut our departments, because that's not ever going to happen. What we can do is we can reform it, we can fix it, we can make it leaner, smaller, and more accountable. And Republican candidates should embrace the concept once again of heading into election with a platform of ideas and not be intimidated by ideas saying, if I am for something, I can be criticized by someone, therefore it is safer to run just against the failures of the other guy, which is what we're doing now. It's enough to win a midterm election. It will never be enough to win a presidential election. So the Republican Party on this front, I think, will have a very wide open competition as we look to 2016. And obviously, Chris Christie, governor of this state, will be a candidate for president, someone who has won in a blue state. I do think that when we look at the presidential elections, that after 8 years of Barack Obama, that there is zero chance, and by zero I mean 0.0, that we will nominate for president a first-term 40-something-year-old United States senator who has never run anything in their life. No chance. The Republican nominee for president will be a governor or be a former governor, and I think those governors that will run will include Governor Christie, Scott Walker if he runs for re-election, John Kasich from Ohio, Susana Martinez could potentially run from New Mexico, Rick Perry will run from Texas. I think Rick Perry, and full disclosure, I do work with Rick Perry's legal team on the kangaroo court indictment that he is facing in Texas for vetoing a piece of legislation funding the office of the district attorney who had a 3.5 blood alcohol level and was spitting on the police officers, but I digress. But again, the governor with the best economic record in the state, who's no longer recovering from back surgery, I think has the potential to be a formidable candidate in the race. And you will see, of course, Rand Paul will be a formidable candidate as well, because he represents a constituency inside of the Republican Party, a libertarian constituency that hasn't been particularly well represented and is really bursting at the seams. And one of the things to understand about American politics is that we tend to look at the fault line as being between left and between being right, between Republican and between Democrat. In reality, the fault line in American politics is increasingly under 40, over 40. There's very few under 40 Republicans that don't support gay marriage. There's enormous majorities of Republicans under 40 that support a woman's right to choose. All of these issues, which have been the divisive wedge issues of American politics, there's fundamental agreement on generationally under 40. And so there is a lot of green space on privacy issues, criminal justice reform, marijuana legalization. As a conservative Republican, my personal view on that issue, for example, is that in a time of fiscal tightness, we have better things to spend $80 billion a year on as a country than chasing around marijuana smokers. Could be because I live in Park City, Utah, but I don't. But I digress again. The point is, there are a range of issues that candidates have not talked about, that Rand Paul is talking about. He is in Ferguson meeting with the NAACP. He is receiving standing ovations when he goes to Berkeley. He is unafraid to bring a conservative and a Republican message to places where it has not been heard. Now, that being said, I think he's completely off the wall on the national security front in a time of real serious global crisis, and I think that will disqualify him from the nomination. But he will be a force in this campaign for sure. When we look at American politics today, we live in a very divisive time, which I don't think is news to anyone here. But I want you all to understand we've never lived in a genteel time in American politics. We are a disputatious people and have been from the first moment the first people got off the first boat in Jamestown and at Plymouth Rock and through the Revolution, but we've always been able to work through our differences. One of the great heroes of this country passed away last year, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii. He was a great Democratic senator. He was a man of impeccable integrity, known for his integrity. He was the first man elected to the House of Representatives from Hawaii, and he's a fascinating story. In 1943, the U.S. Army lifted its restrictions on Japanese Americans being able to serve in the military, and Inouye promptly enlisted. His father admonished him. He said, "Do not dishonor your family's name and come home alive. You go and you fight, and you show the world that we are as every bit of good Americans as any other American." He met his father's promise. In Italy in 1943, he had received a battlefield commission as a second lieutenant. He was shot in the stomach, and he led an assault on the first German pillbox. And he destroyed it single-handedly with machine gun, Thompson submachine gun, and with grenades. He was shot twice more in the leg attacking the second pillbox. And it was the last pillbox that he assaulted where he lost his right arm. And even though his right arm was dangling by a thread, he did not let up the assault. And he charged the pillbox, finished off the Germans, was shot another time or two, passed out, rolled back down the hill. When he came to in a few moments later, he yelled at his men that no one called off the war. He was taken to an aid station. His arm was amputated without anesthesia because he had received so much morphine they thought it would stop his heart. He spent years after the war at the Percy Jones Medical Center recuperating from his war injuries. And during that time, he met another young wounded soldier. He taught him to play bridge, and they became very, very close friends. One day when they were talking, Daniel Inouye's new friend said to him, "What do you want to do when you get out of here?" And Inouye said, "I haven't really thought about it that much." His friend said, "Well, I think I'm going to go home and go into politics. I want to run for office. I want to go to Congress." And so in 1959, when Daniel Inouye becomes the first elected member of Congress from the state of Hawaii, he writes a letter to his friend, and he says, "Here I am, where are you?" Well, that friend, now an old man, when Daniel Inouye was casket, flag covered, cordoned off, as he was laying in state, his old friend from that hospital came to him in a wheelchair to say his final respects. And as he approached those ropes around that casket, he said in his clipped Kansas accent, he said, "Danny wouldn't want to see me sitting in this chair." And Bob Dole stood up and saluted his old friend that he met in that hospital ward to say goodbye. And what that generation of Americans understood, I think Inouye and Dole understood, was that we must be each other's friends. That whatever political differences we have, as Americans, we have so much more in common than those differences will ever yield. And the men of that generation, the greatest generation, and indeed they were, that generation that didn't have the enormous choices that all of you young people do. Their destiny was to storm the beaches and to save the world. Most of them had never been 50 miles further from their hometowns before they joined the military and were sent half a world away. What that generation understood was that we were each other's political opponents, but never each other's enemies, because they faced a real enemy. And they understood the darkness and the evil that that enemy represented. And so we today stand at a time where we talk about our political opponents in the terms of enemy. and we question their patriotism and their love of country, and we assail their motives. And the generation of Americans serving in office now that is dividing us, that is not doing the people's business, that has an inability, it seems, to remember that the only oath that they take is to the Constitution of the United States, not to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. One of the encouraging things is that there's a new generation of Americans returning from war. And there are men like Patrick Murphy out of Philadelphia, who's in Bucks County, who's a Democrat, who is one of the fellows I'm teaching with at the University of Chicago this semester, with close friendships on the other side of the aisle, who understand that what unites all of us is so much greater and so much more profound and so much more important. And while we will disagree, we can work together to make the decisions necessary to create opportunity, to create a growing economy, and to make tomorrow better for every American. And so I'm optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic about our growth. I'm optimistic about American competitiveness. And mostly I'm optimistic because I believe in the American people. And the American people have never been defined by the excesses, cravenness, or fecklessness of our politicians. And when we look at the issues as a country we have to deal with, Churchill was as keen as observer of the American character as anyone who's ever lived. And he said, the Americans in the end will always do the right thing, though they will wait till the last possible second to do it. And he also pointed out that democracy is the worst form of government in all the world, except for every one of its alternatives. And so as we sit here tonight, you look out across the world, we remain the hope of the world. And as you look at the violence and the evil advancing across Syria, across Iraq, as these borders unwind from the drawings that were made 100 years ago after the First World War, the hour of confrontation with this evil has arrived. And the price of dealing with it will only go up from here. The country has a time of testing ahead of it, in my view. And I hope that we will produce the leaders that are capable of dealing with it and preparing the country for what lies ahead. But on the other side of that, I think we will see a generation of Americans grow up in this century, and you will live in an age of wonder, of advances in science and technology, medicine, transportation, that just beggar the imagination. And the possibilities are limitless. And I don't believe, and don't you believe, anyone who tells you that your future is going to be more prescribed, more clipped than what was once all of our futures, because it won't be. And when John Kennedy gave his inaugural address, he talked about the fact that the torch was passing to a new generation, and that torch will pass to your generation before very long. Time will go very, very fast over the next 20 years, believe you me. The older you get, the faster it will go. But your time of leadership is coming, and when it comes, your service, whether it's in the military, public service, community service, make it count. And remember, there are many, many more stories like the one I told you about Inouye and Dole than there are the stories of the people who divide us, who get most of the attention. Look for the good, you will find it. In this country, I guarantee you its best days are ahead. Thank you very much. I did not thank you for that incredibly gracious introduction. I would just say that that it's amazing what nice things people say about you once you stop running campaigns for a living. And it reminded me when I took over the McCain campaign in summer of 2008. There was a lot of very good press written. And my mother called me and she said, "They're saying such great things about you." And I said, "Mom," I said, "there's a very, very thin dotted line between genius and idiot in my line of work." I said, don't get too excited. But thank you, that was very nice.
We have time for a few questions tonight. Since we are recording this evening, I would ask you to please just raise your hand. I will bring the mic to you. And please just introduce yourself so that our speaker and our audience online, so we know who we're having a conversation with.
Good evening, Mr. Schmidt. It's nice to speak with you. My name is Thomas Sabelli, and I just have two quick questions for you. First of all, I'm also an Eagle Scout, so an Eagle Scout to an Eagle Scout. I
Very
know
good.
It's a very tough thing to do, so that's number one. And the two questions I have, first, if we have a Republican, hope to God, in 2016, would you favor, if we could, to repeal Obamacare? That's question number one. And question number two, you talk about how you are concerned with the right-wing talk radio show hosts, such as Levin and Limbaugh, but you sometimes appear on MSNBC, which is a very far-left news outlet, and probably the only show that I would say is fair would be Morning Joe, and then you have people like Al Sharpton and Rachel Maddow and so forth. So I was just wondering why you would appear on that station when it's so blatantly far left. And again, would you repeal Obamacare? Do you think repealing Obamacare is a good thing?
So let me do the Obamacare first. So it's not possible to appeal. It's not possible to repeal en masse Obamacare. And there are some parts of Obamacare which are popular and people like. For example, coverage of pre-existing conditions. We should not be for repealing that. The ability of 25, 26-year-old young men and women to stay on their parents' insurance. The problem with Obamacare, and my criticism of liberalism in general, is this. I think we make a big mistake when we question people's intentions. I have a tremendous number of Democratic friends. Now, honest to God, they didn't pass Obamacare because they wanted to screw up the country. Trust me, I thought they were doing good. Right? They wanted to help people. My criticism of liberalism is the inability, in my view, to differentiate between intentions and results. And what Obamacare is premised on, and by the way, no one read the bill, right? And because most of the bill is unreadable, 1,900 pages of, and this paragraph repeals the comma in subsection C of the 1922 subsection D of this and that and whatever, right? So unless you're, some type of, very specialized lawyer, right, it's not understandable. Now, the 2,000-page bill, right, yields 30,000 pages of regulations. And so part of the issue with Obamacare, and I was on Meet the Press, and the head of the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic were on discussing Obamacare before me. It was very clear to me. I was watching. Neither one of them had any idea what was in the bill. They had no idea. So what do we want to do with health care? We want people to have access to health care. We want people to have access to health care, right, in a cost-efficient way without rationing it. And so Republicans are going to have to come up with ideas, right, about how to provide the best health care in the world, right, without bankrupting the country. And so just repealing Obamacare and, for Ted Cruz, precipitating very nearly a global financial crisis where we defaulted or threatened to on our debt, the full faith and credit of the United States, something not ever contemplated through Civil War, 2 world wars, an extraordinary moment. And so it was unserious, and it was very politically costly in the context of that time. So we have to have a health care plan, but it's got to be realistic, and it's got to be much more than simply shouting slogans of repealing Obamacare. And look, on MSNBC, I'm a news analyst for NBC. I don't control what other people say. I'm a First Amendment absolutist on all of this stuff. I do political analysis, and no one has ever said to me one time when I've been on NBC's air, on the election nights, on the debate nights, about you need to say this, you need to do this. I don't really participate in the food fight. And my approach to the TV stuff has always been to do what I see the former football players do on game day Sunday when they're doing color analysis. I mean, I know Troy Aikman is rooting for the Cowboys, but if they're playing the Giants and the Cowboys are losing 48-0, he's not going to say the Cowboys are doing a good job. And so I've tried to call them like I see them. I've tried to be fair to the president, fair to Republicans. I've had fun doing it. I have a good relationship with Rachel. I don't agree with her on very many political issues, but she's a fine person, and and I tend to worry about like what I say on that stuff. But I particularly don't like the guilt by association nature of American politics. And let me just say this too: there are two types of churches. All right, there's the type of church that seeks converts, and there's the type of church that hunts heretics. The Republican Party has become much too invested in the heretic hunting side. Who's a rhino? Who are we going to kick out? You disagree with me on this issue. You're out of the party. Out, out, out. Political party's got to be about getting people to come in. And the more people you have in the party, the more disagreement there will be. And so there's any one of a number of issues where I think you have to have room for tolerance and dissent inside a political party. You don't want to agree on 100 specific issues. You want to agree on general broad principles, in my view. So hope that is responsive.
Hi, my name's Harvey Waterman, and I work here. I'd like to go back to your discussion of the need for reform in the Republican Party. It struck me that you didn't say anything about money in politics.
Yeah.
But so much of what happens is driven by the donors, it seems to me. And the other thing is that the safety of incumbents in the House and Senate may mean that because they're beholden to their donors, because they have a particular line of constituency, they'd rather keep their seats than worry about the presidential election.
Yeah. So money in politics. I'm not a we had a on the McCain campaign. Campaign finance rules were extremely complicated, and there's all manners of different categories of money in a campaign that you can use for different purposes. And there was one occasion where John McCain, we were outspending that race by $300 million, and John McCain made a comment about why is that rule the way it is? It's really effing stupid. I said, well, that's your bill, Senator, right? It was as bad a piece of legislation ever written, and the Citizens United decision, which everybody, the New York Times and others, argue like let loose the spigot of money in American politics, was an absolutely predictable result of the McCain-Feingold legislation in a country that has the First Amendment. Period. End of discussion. And so here's the deal with money in politics. We've had a 30-year, going back to 1976, we've had a campaign finance debate in this country where we basically say there are different gradients of money, some better, some worse, some more evil than others. And the worst category of money in politics is the money that goes to the political parties and to the actual candidate committees. And so what we have done is like taking a balloon and squeezing it. We have moved the money around like we would move air, but the total amount of air in the balloon is unchanged. And so what have we done? First off, let's look at redistricting and how pernicious an effect that is on a democracy. We have 435 elected members of Congress. There was no more than 25 in a competitive seat. I mean, Rahm Emanuel had the best explanation of this I've ever heard anyone give. He said that we used to live in a country where the voters picked the politicians. Now we live in a country where the politicians pick the voters. It's terrible, okay? Terrible effect. But secondly, what's happened? Political parties, right, have become homogenized ideologically and regionally. It used to be that the Republican Party, it was made up of conservatives for sure, but there were a lot of conservatives in the Democratic Party, and there were a fair number of liberals in the Republican Party, particularly in the Northeast. Phil Gramm was a Democrat who sponsored with Jack Kemp the Reagan tax cuts in 1980. Now, the parties have become homogenized, but the parties have always been stabilizing influences in American politics because their goal is not to advance an ideology, it's to win an election and to assemble a majority. And that means accommodating dissent and tolerance for opposing views and people working across the aisle. What we've done is we've created a system now where it is the case in every single competitive House race in America that the outside groups have larger voices than the actual candidates do. And it's very nearly true in every single Senate race. And so what happens if you have one dissenting vote? An ideological group comes in and imposes discipline. Richard Lugar in Indiana was a great example of this. What was his unpardonable crime? He worked with President Obama. On what issue? Nuclear nonproliferation and our de-weaponizing the Soviet stockpile, of which he was the leading expert in the United States Senate, right? But because the money flows the way it does, not into the campaigns, to the groups, we have created a horrendously bad situation. And the only thing you can do in a country where there's a First Amendment is take off all the limits, have instant disclosure, but allow those unlimited contributions to go into the actual campaign committees. And if you do that, you will shut down the market for all of these outside groups. And I don't know what else to do about the system. Here's the other thing too. If you have a contribution limit of $2,600 at a federal race in like a state like California where it costs $4 million a week to be on television, well then the only people who can run for the United States Senate in California are gazillionaires, right, who will write 30, 40, 50, 60, $70 million checks. Not possible to raise the money required to be on TV at any volume. So it's a very broken system, for sure. But I do think it is a mistake to keep down the path we've been on for 40 years, which is squeezing air around the balloon. Because every time we do, it makes it worse.
Sandy Ekram, thank you for coming. Enjoyed listening to your talk.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Short statement and a question. It seems that since the recession 2008, all the gains have gone to the top 1%. You haven't mentioned inequality and, in fact, things like the minimum wage, the 10-10. What is your, especially the Republican Party, is against those, and especially in terms of fiscal policy, like infrastructure, and to help this. What is your feeling of it?
Well, look, let me, so let's talk about infrastructure for a second. I think it's a huge issue. And, we talk about the Civil Rights Act as being a transformative piece of social legislation, which it obviously was. But the Interstate Highway Act was an absolutely transformative piece of social legislation in that it changed the country fundamentally in the 1950s, Republican president. In the 19th century, the great infrastructure project, of course, was the Transcontinental Railroad, Republican president. Republicans have a long history of supporting infrastructure investment, and the Republican Party should absolutely be for infrastructure investment, whether it's the electric grid, whether it is our falling apart roads and highways. And if you travel internationally, and I do a fair amount of international travel, you come back into an American airport, it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. It was like a third world country. You go to Europe, to Asia, it is startling. And so one of my criticisms from a partisan nature would be when we look at the stimulus, that came after the Great Recession, where did the money go? What did we build? Where are the Golden Gate Bridges and the Hoover Dams? This was a special interest giveaway on steroids of, the highest level of conceivable wastefulness. We built nothing, did nothing with it. And so we need to build and we need to spend in an efficient way. And so no issue with me on that. Look, on the minimum wage, I'm not an economist. And I would say this, is that I'm certainly not prepared to lose elections on the question of the minimum wage, and I would recommend making expedient political decisions about raising it. If you raise it too high, you will have less entry-level jobs. The issue is not about creating minimum wage jobs in the country. I think it's about getting people moving up the academic ladder. And I will say this, and this debate about income inequality drives me crazy to this degree. Income inequality in this country is not a function of the difference between the Bush tax rates and the Clinton-Obama tax rates. You want to deal with income inequality in this country? We better figure out a way in a city like Los Angeles to have an education system that does better than having 50% of the black and Latino kids drop out of high school. Because I damn well guarantee you, you don't have a high school diploma in the 21st century, you're not going to climb the ladder. You're not going to succeed. You're going to be trapped in a cycle of dependency, and that cycle of dependency brings with it every conceivable pathology that you can imagine, from drugs and drinking and abuse and violence and crime. And so if we want to get people moving up the ladder from an opportunity perspective, it starts with education. It starts with having accountable schools, schools that perform. We used to have the best public education system in the world, and now we're probably, somewhere tied for 61st, wherever the rankings are. And that drives income inequality much more than does the difference between a dollar increase in the minimum wage or not, in my view.
We have another question from the student over here.
My name is Henry Grabby. I'm a junior here at Rutgers. For what it's worth, I'm also an Eagle Scout.
Who isn't? No.
You brought up in your talk tonight about how it's going to be really important for Republicans this year, or until 2016, to figure out their platform, hopefully more moderate one when choosing a presidential candidate. But in this election cycle alone, we have a Republican in New Hampshire, Scott Brown, who's in a debate right now over whether he's truly pro-choice, and in Kentucky there's a Democrat who won't even admit that she did or did not vote for President Obama. And I'm sure
Profile and courage.
I'm sure that in the national campaigns have seen how a Republican from the Northeast is not different from a Republican from the Midwest and so on.
Yeah.
So how, if at all, is that possible to get together for a consensus, and how would that happen?
I'm not advocating for a more moderate Republican Party. I'm for a reality-based Republican Party. Let me tell you something. A fundamental aspect of conservatism, right, in your personal life as a personal virtue, and certainly as a governing virtue, is responsibility with money. Okay? And so when the Republican Party threatens to default, right, on the full faith and credit of the United States, it's not conservative. It's radical. You should understand what it is, and we should call it by its name. No true conservative would be in line with that nonsense at any level. Of all the issues, right, that we're dealing with in the country, I mean, there's 100 different ways, and I'm pro-life. There's 100 different ways you can talk about the abortion issue and be successful as a Republican candidate. New Hampshire this election is not going to be decided on abortion. It'll be decided on a lot of other issues. If you can't pivot out of that and back onto issues that are top of mind for people, because I think what most people understand, this is a decided issue in this country, particularly at a federal level. So I think Scott Brown is going to win that race. Allison Lundgren Grimes, the Democrats pulled all their advertising, the Washington Democrats, out of the race today. So that's over. But look, we have any one of a number. Look, the Republican Party's given up 6 U.S. Senate seats, right, in the last 2 election cycles, with guys talking about legitimate rape and a lot of other weird stuff, right? And so we don't have that problem this cycle, so far. 20 days to go. But I feel good about our candidates. But we had a lot of nutty people that were nominated in the last 2 cycles. And you know, the issue, I mean, Christine O'Donnell's a perfectly nice person, I suppose, but I mean, that's a U.S. senator? Come on. And so what happens, right? You give away a Republican seat to the Democratic Party because we nominated someone who did the, you know, I'm a witch ad. And, you know, you look at Sharon Angle in Vermont and a bunch of these other characters, you know, it's like it's a strange bunch. And so, you know, not only are they not, you know, electable in the middle of the electorate, you know, there were a lot of Republicans that wouldn't vote for them.
Hi, I'm Sayu Bojwani. I kind of wish that you would expand your consulting business so that more of your fellow party members sound as coherent and rational as you do. But I run an organization to train immigrants to run for office, so I think that you don't have a demographic problem, you have a messenger problem, and need to work on building your pipeline. Because actually, the Republicans have 4 governors who are Latino and Asian American.
Mhm.
They're just problematic messengers for those communities. So, you know, I think that we hear a lot about the concern that Republicans have about the demographics of the country. And you did a really good job of talking about the messaging. So I just think it's really important to reinforce that point, that it's not that Latinos and Asians are going to consistently vote for the Democrats. It's just the messages coming out of the party are really disturbing. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on where you think the party, where Congress is going to end up on immigration. I mean, the president has talked about administrative action. I'm not sure he's going to follow through with that message because he really hasn't followed through very well on immigration. And so I just would love to hear your thoughts, specifically not on immigration. You use the word immigration in reference to immigrants, but didn't talk about the issue of immigration. So that's what I'd like to hear.
So we tend to talk about immigration in this country like through almost entirely through the prism of Mexico, right, and coming across the southern border. I mean, the reality is, because you've had economic growth in Mexico, you really have net zero illegal immigration flow between Mexico and the United States right now. All the illegal immigration in the country is really on visa overstays. And those people are arriving through airports, generally speaking, not across the desert. We have 12 million undocumented people living in the country because we've had a de facto amnesty in the country for a very long time. I live in a western state, and so you know, the workforce from a migrant labor perspective, from in the services industry, there's such incredible integration, like it just is a matter of reality. There was a great, you know, it was a satirical show, it was like Life Without, a movie a couple of years ago, Life Without Mexican, for a day, to dramatize, you know, how intertwined, you know, and it was all in California. It was a brilliant, you know, take on this. It was funny and everything else. But we have a profoundly stupid immigration system in the country. So, for example, let's say that you are in the United States studying to be a PhD physicist and you're from China. You know what? We want you to stay. And the notion that we determine who gets into the country on the basis of when you got in line is totally wrong. We're a sovereign nation. We should use the immigration system to competitively advantage us. If you are the best and brightest from anywhere in the world, we want you to come to this country, to earn your citizenship in the country, to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, to become an American. I mean, we're the only country in the world that is founded on an idea. We're not on a nationality, not on an ethnicity. And that idea is that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the founding idea of the country. If you buy into that idea, and you can swear fidelity to the Constitution of the United States, the moment that you conclude your oath of citizenship, you are as much an American, no less, no more, than the descendant of someone who came over on the Mayflower. And so we want to have an immigration system that is set up to competitively advantage the country. Now, we have also, as it says at the Statue of Liberty, we've given people opportunity. And we've given them, we've taken in the huddled masses from around the world, and people have succeeded here. their own hard work and their grit and their determination. We're a nation of immigrants. We're also a sovereign nation. Sovereign nation must have control of its borders. We live in an age where we must know who is in the country and who is not in the country. We cannot have an open border with Mexico on the southern border. So the deal has always been this. We will finally, and forever, secure the border physically, and we will secure the immigration system. And in return for doing that, we will put onto a path of regularization and naturalization the people who are here and living in the shadows. And I think that's the contours of the deal. But immigration is much more broad than just the issue of the people that are here living illegally now. And so we should deal with this in a humane and compassionate way. And by the way, for anybody who is out there thinking we should get them out, we should deport them, I would just say two things to y'all. Remember Elian Gonzalez and what that spectacle looked like? Look, by all means, let's do that 12 million times. And I just say too, as a conservative Republican, deeply skeptical about government's capacity to execute and do things. We're talking about the logistics of deporting 12 million people is basically a line of buses from the border to Anchorage, Alaska. And I just don't think we got the team to do it, even if we were so inclined, which we should not be. So we should have an immigration policy that's based in reality. And that's kind of my view on it. And I think you will see a vote. I think it's the one thing that will get done in a new Congress. And the votes are there. I mean, the Hastert rule, which is basically that no bills will be put on the floor of the House that are not supported by a majority of the majority. So there are, in fact, enough votes to pass immigration reform if they would lift the Hastert rule and the Republicans and the Democrats could work together. Hastert rule is very pernicious and should go away on that stuff.
Maybe we have time for one or two more questions.
Sure.
Hello, Mr. Schmidt. My name is Jamil Maroon. I'm actually here representing the North Plainfield School District. I'm the supervisor for the Social Studies Department there. And I want to share a little story. My administrative assistant is 86 years old, and she still comes to work every day. And when I first found out that I was working in North Plainfield, I asked about famous alumni and different alumni. And Mr. Schmidt came up, and his campaign for president, as in your senior year, you ran for vice president.
I was vice president.
Vice president. His campaign was memorable to Jean, Ms. Mullen. My question to you is about education and kind of the different education reforms that keep coming out. We live in a place where we keep trying to reform our public schools, we keep trying to reform the public school system, and neither party seems to have a clear message as far as where we want to go with the schools and what we want to do to reform the school system so that all of our schools are good for all of our students. Many students are byproducts of the public school systems, and we keep hearing that our schools are broken. How do we address these issues, and how does a party like the Republican Party look to address those?
Well, first off, it's nice to see you here. And I'll just tell you, the predecessor of yours in that job was a man named Bill Morgan, who was the chairman of the Plainfield Republican Party and was a absolute cut from the cloth, stereotypical New Jersey, moderate Republican. But his chairmanship of the Plainfield Republican Party gave a bunch of us access who were interested in politics. Governor Kane came to the school on a number of occasions, got to meet Governor Kane, and I'll always remember in 1987 in the Meadowlands, he took us to a breakfast up in the Meadowlands where George Bush Sr. was then vice president, and he was giving a speech, and his way out, Vice President Bush saw all of us kids sitting there, and he came by the table. And he literally sat down. He talked to us for 15 minutes. It was remarkable, and I remember how deeply impacted I was by that. And I had the chance to tell President Bush that story in the Oval Office a generation later, President Bush 41 with his father there, which he was amused about at our first meeting. And so that's the difference a teacher can make in a kid's life. And I owe my political career absolutely 100% to your predecessor in that job, Bill Morgan. He lighted a fire in me in something that I was interested in, found passion in. He was a remarkable teacher in every sense of the word. Look, I think like education reform, I mean, there's so much politics infused all around this. There's too much teacher bashing probably in my party. There's too much fear of the union in the other party, though that's starting to break. I do know this. You can't have an institution, any institution, where you can't fire people, right? You don't perform, you get fired. There's no such thing, in my view, as a guaranteed job for life because you've held it for 3 years and a day. And so there are lots of great teachers, but the teachers that aren't great, we got to get them out. And the way you get the bad teachers out, I think, is to dramatically increase the pay for teachers. And so, what do we value as a society, right? And how do you compensate it? And so I think we should dramatically increase the pay for teachers. You have to have institutions that are accountable to the performance of the function that they exist for. And look, I think we got to teach history and civics and a sense of the country, but you got to have schools that produce kids that can read and write and do math. And I will just tell you, I work as the vice chairman of the largest public relations firm in the world. And I have been involved in politics at the very highest level. I cannot tell you how many Ivy League graduates out of the finest institutions in the world who cannot write a paragraph in the English language, right? Cannot do it. Makes no sense. I just graduated from Harvard. Great. This is your remedial writing course. You're at your first job. And so, I think those core deals are, what we got to do. But I'm not an expert in the issue. But I know for sure you don't make schools better by bashing the teachers.
We have actually maybe two last questions. I know you have a question. I know you were my second question before. So.
My name is Kevin Lubin. I'm in Eagleton undergraduate class of 2010.
I thought you were about to say you were an Eagle Scout.
I'm not an Eagle Scout. My question is regarding the division in the Republican Party that you alluded to with the emerging libertarian faction, differences in opinion of Republicans under 40 and over 40, and the divisions or differences that the gentleman up front alluded to between a Northeastern Republican and a Southern Republican. And so my question is whether you believe there's a place in the immediate future in the Republican Party for a more fiscally conservative, socially moderate candidate like a Rand Paul to succeed in the Republican Party, and can a candidate like that get through a primary without?
Rand Paul's no social moderate. He's very pro-life, but there are issues that he is talking about that are new issues in the sense of mass incarceration, militarization of police departments, surveillance, privacy. There's a whole new grouping of issues that haven't been on the national agenda that have resonance with people under 40 years old. And it's just a myth in this country, right, that you can't be elected if you're pro-life, even in a state like New Jersey, i.e. Chris Christie. That's not what the issue is on these social issues. And I'll just give you one example on gay marriage, for instance. So the Obama campaign essentially spent $50 million less on television than the Romney campaign did, but they ran 400,000 more ads. How did they do that? Because of their use of data, the analytics, the measurement, the calculations, the 64 PhD computer scientists on the staff. Very tough as a Republican to recruit PhD computer scientists out of Silicon Valley if they think you work for a party that's discriminating against their gay friends, colleagues, brothers, and sisters. And so these social issues deposition the party competitively amongst a generation of people we need to have working inside the Republican Party, in politics, because, look, one of the reasons I went into politics is, math was not my friend. And so I don't really understand that stuff in terms of the ability to do all the data analytics and all of that, but I know it needs to happen, right? And so, there's a whole cascading of issues that fall from that. But yeah, look, I do think there's room in the Republican Party for, its moderate wing, and people have to, look, my case is, whether it's Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh, and they attack you and call you a moron or names, and you get hate mail and death threats and all this stuff. But like, I'm letting these guys kick me out of the Republican Party for believing what I believe in. It's just as much my party as it is theirs. And it's like any institution, and I think the Republican Party, its history, its legacy. I also think this is true about the Democratic Party as well. These are two of the greatest institutions in the history of the world for the advancement of human freedom, for the advancement of human dignity. And these are the vehicles by which have produced our leaders in a country that is unique in all the world. In all the history of the world, there has never been a country that is made up of all the people of the world, that is made up of all the people of the world in a country where all the languages of the world are spoken every day, that has done more good, freed more people, liberated more people, fed more people, clothed more people, than all the other countries of the world put together since the beginning of time, right? And the vehicles by which we produce these leaders are out of these two political parties. And so I think they're worth fighting for, shaping, participating in. And so if you're a Republican and you're not happy about the direction of the party, you got to do what you got to do in a democracy, which is to get involved and go and fight for it.
My name is Shanice. I'm a current Rutgers student actually studying political science. My question has to do with what we just spoke about, actually.
I would have been too if I could have gotten in.
My question is more to reproach the rebrand of the party. If the next political candidates have to rebrand the party, how do they go about approaching or addressing social issues without individuals feeling like disliked or attacked, like the Hispanics did when it came to immigration?
I think that I don't like the word, so first off, like you rebrand Folgers coffee. You don't necessarily, and I might have used the word rebrand earlier, but that's not really what I'm talking about. It starts off with a candidate going out there and presenting an optimistic vision for making people's lives better. All people of the country, okay? And so you have to have ideas, policies, right? What are your ideas and policies, right, that can make the country a better place, create more opportunity, more economic growth, right? What are they? How do you talk about the threats the country faces, the real dangers in the world? What's at stake? Mitt Romney, the first requirement of a Republican candidate for president of the United States. I mean, you can be someone who is the fastest guy on the field. You have the ability to throw a football further than anyone has ever thrown a football accurately before. You can run faster than any quarterback has ever run in the NFL. But if you can't take the snap from the center without fumbling it, you can't play in the NFL. And so for a Republican candidate, the very first order of business is to defend as virtuous for 100% of the people who live in the country free market American capitalism. It's for the good. Trickle-down liberalism, right, which is the notion of that the government's going to decide who gets what share of an ever-shrinking pie, is wrong. And we can have an argument about it. And I believe we can win the argument about how you grow opportunity, grow an economy, create jobs. All of these things are fundamentally more important and top of mind than all of these wedge issues. I mean, I started out tonight talking about looking back historically, and I think there's no finer man that's ever been president than George Herbert Walker Bush, a true American hero, a deeply honorable man who spent a great deal of his life in service to his nation. But that campaign that elected him was over a lot of stupid issues. Flag burning, Willie Horton, Pledge of Allegiance, all this stuff. Understand that all this war on women stuff and everything else, right, is the same cousin of that stupidity, right, from the other side. It might make for good politics, right, but you want to see a war on women, right? Focus on what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Syria or Pakistan, where you can stone 14-year-old girls to death. That's a war on women. There's no war on women in this country, and certainly not by the Republican Party. Some of these issues, abortion and others, are profoundly important questions at stake. We ought to have a debate in this country on some of these issues. That's not a war on women. And Republican candidates got to toughen up, got to be able to push back, and got to be able to win an argument. One of the things that was remarkable about Mitt Romney's first debate performance, it was the first time that the country saw an articulate, conservative message on television in a debate against a Democrat since 1984. George Walker Bush, I have the deepest affection and respect for him, eternally grateful for the opportunities afforded me. John McCain, the same. But I think that they would be the first to admit that they weren't necessarily known for their eloquence and articulateness, and many other virtues, in my view. But we have to have candidates in a media age who can push back, fight through, articulate, make an argument, have plans, have an agenda. And absent that, you wind up stuck in the position we're stuck in now, which is trapped in all of these issues. Because if you don't have things you're for, you wind up in a debate defending against things you're against. And it's not a good place to be. It's like being in a rock fight on the downhill side of it.
The women's movement, there was, you probably heard this, there was this talk always about Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire could do, but she did it backwards. He did all of this with a broken foot. I kept thinking about what this must feel like. I just want you to know I have worked at this university for a long time. We've made just a couple of mistakes over the years, but one of the biggest ones we've ever made was turning you down. Thank you so much.
Thank you.